All right, welcome to this Domain University presentation. This is our classroom presentation on how much is a domain name worth. So hopefully you've learned about the domain name system. You've got some familiarity with why and how domain names came about and about how you register a domain name. And now, at least for those of you that are domain name investors, this will be a big part of the class for you here at Domain University. But as well, those of you that own domain names, you're managing for a company, you're managing your own domain names. If you find that you need to sell a domain name that may not be part of your core business, or you want to go buy a domain name, you want to maybe know what you want to get into. So we're going to talk about what domain names are worth. How much is a domain name worth? The answer, of course, is it's worth whatever it's worth to a seller, and it's worth whatever it's worth to a buyer. If I'm the seller, you've got to give me something in this hand that'll make me want to give you this domain name. And until you do, I have the right to keep this domain name. No one can make me sell this domain name to you. And if you're a buyer and I ask for too much money, you always have the ability to walk away. The key thing to remember in negotiations and strategy is you'll never know how much the buyer would have paid. You might sell it too low, you might sell it too high, only he's going to know that. So one of the only ways to know what a domain name worth sometimes is to keep saying no, and you'll find the buyer going up and up and up and up. But you run the risk they walk away. But some of the biggest, the most exciting domain name sales that have happened in our business have come about because we really don't know what a domain name is worth. So if someone says, hey Paige, how much is that domain name? A lot of times I'm just making up the number off the top of my head. Whether it's a two-word name that I'm saying, 1,000 or 1,500 or 3,000 or 5,000, or whether it's a big one-word premium name and someone says $1 million or $1.5 million or 800,000, right now we're just making up these numbers. The buyer knows what it's worth to them. They know that if they're a $50 million company and they're spending $5 million advertising their brand, and this name can make their advertising 10% better, that's a $500,000 a year value to them each and every year. So for you to say a domain name's worth $1 million, and they're like, we get $500,000 a year of value off of it, then that's terrific for them and it's terrific for you. For a small business, people just want stuff. I want that name. I'm a real estate agent. I live in a town here near Tullahoma. So say Tullahoma, someone wanted to own Tullahoma real estate because they wanted to be seen as the best real estate broker in Tullahoma. I say it's $4,000. Well, some of them may say, I don't want it in a heartbeat. Some of them may say, I'll take it because you know what? People spend $4,000 on a week's vacation or a full-page newspaper ad. So the truth is we don't really know exactly what domain names are worth, and because of that, there's huge opportunity. But I want to look at some basic principles of valuation that comes really from the real estate industry. And if you do real estate appraisals, or if you hire us to do an appraisal for you, we're going to talk about the cost method of appraisal, the income method of appraisal, and comparative sales. The cost method of appraisal really gets down to what would it cost to get that domain name. Now, they're not making that many more domain names. So domain name is singularly and unique. And once someone buys it for a certain amount of money, they may say, well, I'm not going to sell it and take a loss. So their cost is very important in the valuation of that domain name. At the same point, you have to assess whether that domain name can be duplicated. So say I was talking about the domain name earlier, TullahomaRealEstate.com, or say it was a bigger city, BostonRealEstate.com, and someone determined that BostonHomes.com was just as good. Well, if you were trying to sell BostonRealEstate.com for $50,000, and someone also could go out and buy BostonHomes.com for, say, $15,000, then it would be hard for you to keep asking $50,000 for Boston Real Estate. On the other hand, you can. So one of the things about the cost method is basically that we do have a listing of what all domains out there are being sold for, or you have to go find out and say, what is that domain name sold for? And if you can show a buyer that he can't get a domain name as good as yours for less than what you're asking, that goes a long way in him having to say, how much do I want this domain name for? He may just want to feel like he's not getting a bad deal, that he's not paying above market. And so the cost factor, it's not your cost in the domain name, although it could be when in the case of some high value names, it's more what is normally the cost going to be to replace that domain name. Now, the buyers. The buyers want to say, well, gee, a domain name only costs $8 a year or $9 a year. I should be able to go get one for that, so yours shouldn't cost any more. And that's where we get into the idea of scarcity. That yes, you can buy any domain name for $9 a year, but is it going to be as good as the one I've got to sell you? And if it's not, then you've got to pay up to get mine. So, second way to value a domain name is what is the income that it produces. If my domain name has natural traffic coming, or based upon search conversion is listed and gets traffic and it's earning $10 or $100 or $1,000 a month, I can value that domain name as a multiple of the income I'm earning. If I'm earning $100 a year and I apply a 10% cap rate to it, then my $100 a year is just like having $1,000 in the bank paying 10% interest. So why would I ever want to sell that for less than $1,000 if it's earning me $100 a year? You have a domain name that's earning you $1,000 a month, that's $12,000 a year. You're probably not going to want to sell that domain name unless someone can give you enough money to pay you for all that lost income over the next 5, 10, or 20 years. So the income method is one of the ways that people can hardly ever argue with you in terms of what that name is worth, because you've got specific stats that say this is how much I'm earning off the name now that I'm going to walk away to sell the name to you. And then lastly is comparative sales. We can say other domain names have sold for a certain amount of money. So if you take a name that you take one of the words in the name and you apply some different adjectives that are synonyms and you come up with comparable sales that are happening in that range, that's another way to show people how much domains are worth. But because domain names are singular and unique, it's hard to really apply that to what is the value of your name. So in most cases it gets down to what you're asking for the name, what do you take? And the buyer doesn't want to pay that. They don't want to. So they're going to try to find ways to tell you it's not worth that, it's not worth that, it's not worth that. And the most successful investors in our space have simply stuck to their guns, and they know that the only time they're ever going to sell a name is when they run into a buyer that truly appreciates that value, truly wants to pay that price, and they don't want to sell it to someone who just wants to pay less. So let's talk about some more parts of what is a domain name worth. What information do we have? This is when a domain name is selling right now. This is the way this chart is set up. We have prior sales that are real and that real people paid certain amounts of money, and you can see these reports at DN Journal every week, but they're singular. They only apply to that transaction. Just because somebody bought a domain name last week of a certain amount doesn't mean they don't need another domain name, so they don't need to come back and pay it again. And we have the idea that no two names are similar, but you can use prior sales to give your buyers an idea of what domain names are trading at. Because they may just not want to think that they're being ripped off, or they may not want to overpay. So if you can take your name and show comparable names that have sold for about the same amount as you're asking, you're supporting the price. Now, the other thing you have to talk about, though, is what's the future of your domain going to be? You're selling this singular, unique asset, and you're selling the buyer everything that that domain name will become. So if you're in a future trend that isn't really apparent right now, then you don't necessarily want to look at past value. You want to be able to say in the future it could be this, or it could be this, or it could be this. Conversely, some domain names have a better past than they do future. But I think you have to look at the components of it that have happened in the past that are real. You want to look at what's going to happen in the future. Now, there's a lot of other things that come into a domain name's value that have to do with the individual transaction that don't even have to do with the name. What's the buyer's desire? Have they already committed to an advertising campaign that's using a certain domain name, a certain phrase that they need to have the domain name? Then they may be in a position where they need to get it, and based upon the amount of money they're spending, they're ready to pay a super high price. Same point, you could have a reluctant seller. The seller's like, I've always liked this name. I've always wanted to get 10 grand for this name. I've always wanted to get 100 grand for this name. I've always wanted to get 50 grand for this name. Even if it doesn't make sense, they're going to hold out for that. And it may have nothing to do with the industry, nothing to do with the trend, nothing to do with prior sales. It's simply what they want. Which marketplace is the name on? You may have a marketplace that's a wholesale marketplace, so people are used to paying low prices. So people know if they want to get names sold in that marketplace, they've got to come in with low prices. At the same time, you may have other marketplaces that deliver the name at the exact time the buyer's looking for it, or know that the buyer's looking for that exact name, and there may be higher premium prices paid there on those marketplaces. Then, of course, you have trends. Someone may have priced their domain name, if you're looking to buy it, 5 years ago, based upon the value of a trend. Something gets popular, you may be able to go and buy a name for a good value if they haven't updated their price. And then information. This is probably the biggest thing that happens in a negotiation. Someone inquires on a domain name and you try to get the most information you can about how the buyer is going to use the name. What are they going to use it for? At the same time, the buyer is trying to get the most information they can from you about how much you may have had that name for sale for in the past. They may even try to find out how much you bought the name for. And each side is kind of arming themselves to go into a negotiation based upon information. So the more information that you're going to get on the buyer to try to find out what they're using it for may help you price the name. A lot of times buyers will use fake email addresses. One of the very popular things you'll see is people emailing you and say, I just want to use this domain name for my kids' homework project. And somewhere out there must be a blog post for buyers that say, try that method, and maybe the domainer will be a nice guy and sell you that name. And then you find out a month later that it was sold to, some huge Fortune 500 corporation. So now you've talked about the attributes of each sale have to do with the buyer, the seller, the marketplace, what's happening with current trends, and which side has most information. And then you have the fact that even if we know how much the domain's worth, then you could just have someone who just says, hey, times are tough, it's a slow week, there's a recession on, the stock market's down, we're right in the middle of the holiday period, so I don't want to, even though it's worth $10,000, I just want to pay $5,000. So we don't know either one of those two things. We don't necessarily know what domains are worth, and then we don't know what people want to pay. Now, someone that buys the name for investment, they may be holding it for a while. So they may say, I really don't need to buy the name, but I'd like to buy the name. So they may not want to pay a high price. At the same point, the liquidity of the seller is going to be important. How long you've held the name. What is the risk of holding the name? What is the risk that a current trend may go up or down? What is the risk that names in this area may go up or down? So all these things come into the fact that you've come to this seminar to find out how much is a domain name worth. And each domain name, you have to start looking at all these attributes to come up with the price. And then once you come up with the price, you have to sit there and say, how willing am I to sell this name, or willing am I to buy this name, that no matter what it says it's worth, I'm either going to pay up or I won't pay up, or if you're a seller, I'm going to take this offer because I know I can get that money and reinvest it. So one of the things that we talk about a lot in domain name investing has to do with the price that we're going to get for domain names. Let's see if we can see this. All right, so I've used this before for a slide, so I'm going to use it again. So this is money. This line right here is money. And the higher amount of money we can get for a domain name, the best and ultimate price we can get for a domain name is up at the top. That's how much would the best buyer who can use the name to make the most money and wants it now pay for the domain name. And I'm going to wait and not sell to anyone else until I get that ultimate buyer. That's the ultimate buyer. And at the bottom, we have this wholesale buyer, okay? Where a wholesale buyer, this right here is your domain name, and these are all the other domain names that are available for sale, 269 million of them. Now, a wholesale buyer says, I don't need to pay you the ultimate price for that name. I'm looking at every name that's available for sale, and I'm trying to get the best deal I can. So I want to pay 15% or 10% or 5% or 1% of that ultimate value for a domain name. And depending on how many domain names they want to buy, whether they're investing money or whether they're withdrawing money, they're going to look at it and they're going to want to pay a wholesale price because they're comparing it against all the other domain names that can be bought. So there's our wholesale floor. So we have our wholesale value and we have our ultimate value. Then we have our buyers who come along. Here's our buyer. Your buyer may come along and he may or may not be the best buyer that you're going to find in the next 5 years. He may like your name. He may only have $1,000 in his pocket. And even though you tell him and you convince him that your name is worth $50,000, it's like I only have $1,000 in my pocket. And you got to make the decision, do you want to sell it, get the $1,000 and go reinvest it and try to make more money elsewhere, or are you going to wait? So that's the choice you have to make as your seller. You can't make him buy your name. You could show him how the domain name's money, but qualifying him and whether or not he's got the money to pay your price, most of the time, the only way you're going to find that out is by quoting him a price, he's going to offer you a price, and you're going to have to say no and walk away. with no hint that you might have taken lower. And it's only when you absolutely walk away, and walk away for a day, and walk away for a week, and don't email him back, that you may find out if he says, I was just kidding, really I'm this big company and we want to buy it for a bunch of money. So if your strategy when you're selling domain names is to get the ultimate price, you may take some of the tactics that people have employed. They don't even respond to inquiries. Say, well, if the guy really wants to get a hold of me, he'll contact me again. Now, if your strategy is to do high volume turnover, that's the worst thing in the world you can do. You're like, I want to get a hold of everybody, I want to contact them, I want to get some money for my name and turn it over. But I think you have to assess when you own the name, how close are you going for the ultimate price, or you come down here for the wholesale price. Now, what we have going on right now in the domain name business is there's a lot of activity right around the wholesale price of a name. So I'm going to put red X's here. This is going to represent activity. And based upon the likelihood that people are going to be able to get an ultimate value for a name, they're going to want to come back down and pay the wholesale price and be able to sell it for the ultimate price. And so based upon the number of investors you have, remember this is the price of a name, so say the ultimate price of a domain name sell for is $100,000, and down here the wholesale price is $2,000. So that's about what we have in our industry. You can buy names that could sell for $100,000. You might be able to find them for $2,000. But you're probably going to find the worst ones. So you say, well, I'm willing to pay $8,000 for a domain that might be worth $100,000. Now, you may leave a lot of these guys behind. They may say, well, gee, I wouldn't do that. I'd only pay $4,000. So you may be in a position where you're going to outbid all the wholesale buyers, get the name for $8,000, and then you're going to try to hold it and sell it for $100,000. Now, if you do this 5 or 10 times and it's working for you, you're going to have unique knowledge that it's working, and you're going to be willing to pay maybe $10,000 or $12,000 if no one else knows. Now, if everyone else finds out about it, they're going to come along and say, gee, I'm going to pay $9,000, $10,000, and we can have a lot of action in the wholesale value. And the other thing that can happen is people can say, you know what, I'm going to put on a wanted board. I want, say this is for a dictionary domain name. I want a dictionary one-word domain name, and I'll pay $8,000. Then someone else says, well, gee, I'm going to try to pay $6,000 and buy them and sell them to you at $8,000 in the wholesale market, because I can get that money really quick, having nothing to do with the ultimate end user. And when that happens, we get a lot of action around the wholesale price. So the action at the ultimate price is very rare, happens sporadically. But in total, we get those sales reported each week. So you see a name selling for 5 or 10 or 30,000. You may say, that's awesome. I want to buy more of those. But you don't know if the same sale of that type of name may not happen again for another 5 or 10 years. So what a domain name investor does is buys a name at the wholesale price to try to sell it for the ultimate price. The more likely it is that this name is going to sell for an ultimate price within a short time period, the more people are going to want to buy it, and that's going to give it a greater wholesale price. If the likelihood that a name is going to sell for an ultimate value is declining, more wholesale investors are going to walk away and not want that domain name, and you may be able to buy it lower or below wholesale. So if you have to ask yourself, when you're getting a name below what everyone else is paying for the wholesale cost, is it because something's happened to the ultimate value of those domain names and the price is dropping? Then your job as a domain name investor is to buy it, wait for the ultimate sale, or try to use action or energy to make that happen. So that's a bunch of discussion from today's lab on what is a domain worth and how to make money in domain names. So thanks. My name is Paige Howe. This is DomainUniversity.com.